Recently, I appeared on the podcast Tell Us the Truth, hosted by a great guy named E. Duke Bennett. Now, on the podcast, I shared my experience of growing up in an interracial family with three white step parents and four biracial siblings. I want to clarify that in talking about my experience growing up in an interracial family, both my biological parents are African American, but they happen to marry white people. Both my mom and my father married white people. So I don't have the perspective of someone who is actually biracial. I have more of a unique perspective of someone who is African American, but was raised in an interracial family. As I related on the podcast, growing up in the 1970s and 80s, no one seemed to notice or care that our family was interracial. Even though my city, Columbus, Ohio, is in the middle of America in a what has become a ruby red state, no one seemed to ostracize my family for going against the grain and being unusual. In fact, my family received so little negative attention or any attention at all. I thought my family was completely normal growing up. Now, from the way I described my experience, you would think that growing up in an interracial family was all about hearts and flowers, and we were all going around shooting rainbows out of our ears. And I also talked about how on the Black side of my family, that there was very little colorism that I was aware of. I have light-skinned cousins whose parents are both African American, but they were not treated any differently or better than me, and I happen to be brown-skinned or darker than they are. Now, by saying these things, you could certainly get the impression that I believe and am trying to promote the concept of colorblindness. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, in this video, I'm going to try to debunk the myth of colorblindness. Colorblindness is not a thing. It does not exist. And the fact that I grew up in an interracial family with my white stepfather as the head of the household, with my Black mother and me, a Black child, and my biracial siblings, the fact that we didn't get harassed or ostracized may be explained by a study I came across that was conducted by the Pew Research Center. This study found that interracial couples, because of the obstacles and challenges they face in society, are more likely to get divorced than couples of the same race. Now, that alone disproves the theory of colorblindness, that love is blind and that society will accept any two people who fall in love no matter what race they are. But a key component of this study sheds light on why my experience is not a universal experience. This study found that in interracial couples in which there is a Black woman and a white man, or a woman of color and a white man, that they were less likely to get divorced than couples where the man was a person of color. So in the case of my family, where my stepfather, who is white, was the head of the household, it explains why perhaps our family didn't get harassed, because people tend to defer to white men and white men's judgment. Plus, white men tend to have more economic opportunities than people of color. So my stepfather was an engineer, so our lights never got turned off. No other utilities got turned off. We were never at any point in danger of being evicted from our house that I know of anyway. So the fact that my family didn't experience a lot of external discrimination may have been due to this factor of people deferring to white men and people just assuming that my white stepfather could choose whomever he wanted to as a mate. And I want to emphasize that in sharing my experience, I'm in no way negating the experiences of other interracial families that were ostracized and discriminated against. There is no such thing as a universal experience. You know, I think talking about race is a healthy thing. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. The only way change happens in society is by people speaking up and raising uncomfortable issues. The civil rights movement was not about appeasing people or making people in power comfortable. It was about pushing back. You have to push back and have uncomfortable conversations for there to be any progress in society. You know, some people have the perspective that racism will die out when all the old racists from back in the day themselves die out. But I want to gently push back on that by saying that that is total. Racism, unfortunately, does not have an expiration date. You know, I'm a journalist, and in recent months, I've written about fairly upscale schools, high schools where white students were bullying students of color. It was online bullying, and this did not happen in the 1950s or 60s, obviously, because social media didn't exist back then. And this bullying was taking place over social media. I think we need to get out of the mindset that one's birth date is going to somehow immediately inoculate you against the very human tendency to hate. Young people may be less racist and more progressive, speaking generally, but don't we all know the danger in generalizing? Reality is a lot more complex and nuanced. I think that we have to be vigilant in educating racism out of people, no matter what their age. So to sum up, even though I grew up in an interracial family in a time where people marrying outside of their race wasn't necessarily the most common thing, the fact that my family was not discriminated against or ostracized, at least not in an overt way that I was aware of, does not make my experience universal and does not in any way support the myth of colorblindness. Colorblindness is just that, a myth. Those are my 2 cents on the issue. Please leave your comments and let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. In part 2 of this episode, I'll have a conversation with my good friend, Duke Bennett, host of the Tell Us the Truth podcast, and we'll clarify what I meant when I appeared on the podcast in 2021 and said that even though my family was interracial and was different, we didn't encounter any discrimination that I was aware of. And Duke and I will share our experiences, me growing up in Middle America in what is known as the biggest small town in the United States, and Duke growing up in the Boston area with his own multicultural family.
When it comes to telling the truth, because that's the point, right? When it comes to telling the truth, we can't dictate what the experience is going to be because it is what it is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that it was very important for you to offer a perspective, once again, that not many people have ever heard before.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Again, you're coming from a situation where both your parents remarried, and they remarried white folks, and you have siblings on both sides, right? Who are interracial.
Yes.
And you have a situation in which, as you grew up, the racism wasn't what someone would expect it to be on the outside.
Right.
You know what I mean? Your experience matters too. And we need to hear about the experience of folk like yourself in order to get a better picture of society as a whole.
If you like this video, please leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to my channel.